Today is Wednesday, August 26, 2020, and there's a lot of information, misinformation, a lot of people talking about slavery and the sins of America or the scars of our past. I've pointed out in previous videos and writings that the way the modern religious systems have adjusted both religion and history, because history with the education system works the same way, is they go off the cycle of three. The first generation that is either converted or being programmed with historical information is usually they reject it or they return to the previous way. By the second generation of that indoctrination, that gaslighting, if you will, history written by the victors, the sanctioned versions, by the second generation, they're getting more imbued. That information is becoming part of who they are. And they look at this generation, the first generation, as, well, you don't know. I have the new and updated information. And so they kind of start to reject that first generation. By the third generation, they are so indoctrinated, so gaslighted with information that becomes part of their fabric. And now they start to spread these lies, this sanctioned versions of history and religion. And then the first generation and previous to that information is lost. So when you're talking about things like ancient things like paganism or history, that's what we're talking about here. History, the history of slavery. By the time these United States of America became these United States of America, the three religions that were dominant were Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. And they are well entrenched with slavery. They gave themselves divine sanction in their writings that slavery was okay. So by the time the founding fathers of these United States of America, who are operating in those systems around the world, these systems were in play. I've made a previous video on this, so I won't go into a lot of in-depth information here. But the founding fathers of America, while they owned slaves, they were rebelling against global system of slavery entrenched from those global religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So you have to take that in light. The entire world owned slavery. So just by saying, well, Thomas Jefferson owned slaves, so therefore he is a slave owner and a racist, you're missing the larger point. The larger point is the world owned slaves. Every nation, every Abrahamic nation around the world owned slaves of all colors. The founding fathers of America rebelled against that. And they said slavery wasn't evil, and the slave trade is deplorable. So they were fighting against global systems. Now, the system of slavery, domestic slavery, is still in existence in Africa today. But nobody addresses that. That's not the issue I want to discuss here, though. The issue I want to discuss here is we've heard slavery, slavery, slavery. You even have a 1619 project out there talking about when black slaves were first brought to the American colonies in 1619 on the slave ship, the Dutch Jewish ship called the Desire. But then that slave trade stopped for about 100 years because to engage in the African slave trade with the Muslims, who are already for hundreds of years engaged in the trans-Saharan slave trade, was very expensive. And they had a cheaper form of slavery, and that was white slavery. And that's what I want to take a minute to discuss, because third generation, remember, white slavery has been denounced into two words: indentured servitude. And indentured servitude in history is a farce. It's, again, third generation. By the third generation, they spew it forward that, oh, white slaves were only indentured servants, and they obligated themselves into contracts, which they, at the completion of, then they would be free. That is third generation mentality. That is being spewed forth by people who, well, they don't read history books. They just, whatever gaslighting is in play at the time, that's what they regurgitate and maybe even become woke tards from. So there's a number of books out there. I'll introduce the books first. I have absolutely no claim to these books. They are not my writings. They are just part of my library of books, which you see behind me is a very small portion of. These books are 100% the authors, and I am not getting paid to give you these books, but they are good reads. This is the first book. It's called The Pirate Coast. And this book talks about Thomas Jefferson and creating the Navy, the United States Navy, and interjecting that United States Navy to shut down the Muslim slave trade in Africa, which was, once they shut that down off of northern Africa, I got this in a previous video, they continued to try to go east. This book is about Thomas Jefferson and creation of the United States Navy to that end. And it does talk about white slaves, how they went into Europe as far north as Iceland to get white slaves, bring them to Africa, and sell them as slaves. The next book is White Cargo. The next book, The Irish Slavers. The next book deals with white slavery going to the West Indies and to the colonies. And also, and this next book addresses, here's the cover, it also addresses the different forms of slavery. You have domestic slavery, which all colors and all ethnicities enslaved and were enslaved. This book also deals with the wage slave, how young children were forced to become wage slaves to essentially keep the family alive. So the last book is the book, I'm gonna read a couple sections out of this, because right now we have a vice presidential candidate, Kamala Harris, and there's videos out there saying that, and researchers out there saying that Kamala Harris was the top cop in California, and that she comes from a ancestry of slave owners. And I believe the great-great-great-great-grandfather was Hamilton Brown. Now, there's some people that are saying, well, Hamilton Brown, he raped a slave, and that's how that was in there, and she's a victim or a product of a victim. And that's not true. Hamilton Brown, while he was a slave owner in Jamaica, had a son by the name of Hamilton Brown. And Hamilton Brown, the son, then fell in love with an emancipated slave in Jamaica. And that's where Kamala Harris comes from. Not from a rape, but from a couple that fell in love. And the son was the son of a slave owner. So, and he, I guess he owned several plantations, had hundreds of slaves. So Kamala Brown comes from a ancestry of slave owners and a privileged status, essentially. And a person that points this out very well is on YouTube is Dinesh D'Souza. So I'm not going to go over everything he says. Research that on your own. The next book is To Hell or Barbados. Now this covers Barbados, this covers Jamaica, this covers the colonies, and that's what I want to read for you right here. Just a couple of excerpts out of this to give you a taste of what you have lost in knowledge. Remember, third generation. By the third generation, this is gone. And indentured servitude, does it really matter if you are in the indentured servitude program for 10 years or 7 years, I think that's what they say is the going limit for indentured servitude. They would sign themselves up for 7 years and sign themselves up for 7 years. And then at the end of that 7 years, then they were a free person. Does that really matter if within 2 years you were dead because your white slavery was so brutal and you were so cheap to buy for these slave owners that you were throwaway? You were expendable. So remember, slavery from Muslim Africa at the time to the colonies, to the West Indies, was massively expensive, much more expensive. So they stopped doing the African slavery to the West Indies and the colonies for about 100 years. So let me just read a few pieces out of this book, To Hell or Barbados, by Sean O'Callaghan. Okay, we're going to begin on page 63. A letter dated 8 November 1654 and written by Thomas Herbert, the clerk of the council, Dublin Castle, to Daniel Searle, the governor of Barbados, confirms the Council of Ireland's decision to transport priests. His Highness and Council for the Affairs of Ireland have ordered Captain John Norris to take aboard his ship diverse Irish men and women, such as by the justice are found to be vagabond and idlers, to be exported to the Barbados or some other of the English plantation islands or of the Caribbean or thereabouts. Now, what must be remembered about these so-called vagabonds is how they got to that status. The ancestral homelands of the Irish were stolen from them. They were given to the nobles of England. Those nobles allowed that ancestral land to continue to be farmed by the people who had previously owned it for generations upon generations. The nobles then had enclosure laws passed which kicked those tenant farmers off of their own lands. So now you have this displaced people who have to survive somehow. So they took to the streets. Some became beggars, some became prostitutes. The children became chimney sweeps and other labor. So you had this system of first the land is stolen, then the land is fenced, and then the people have to do what they have to do to survive, and then they're labeled as vagabonds, criminals, put onto criminal ships and transported to Barbados, Jamaica, the West Indies, the American colonies as slaves, white slaves. Continuing on page 74, Richard Legone, the first historian of Barbados, writing in 1657, gave an account of the indentured servants' introduction to their daily life on a plantation in Barbados. Upon the arrival of any ship, the planters go aboard, and having bought such of them as they like, send them with a guide to his plantation, and being come, commands them instantly to make their cabins, which they, not knowing how to do, are to be advised by other of their servants that are their seniors. But if they be churlish, and will not show them, or if materials be wanting to make them cabins, then they are to lie on the ground that night. These cabins are to be made of sticks, withes, and plantain leaves, under some little shade that may keep the rain off. Their suppers being a few potatoes, and water and moby for drink. The next day they are rung out with a bell to work at 6 o'clock in the morning, till the bell rings again, which is at 11 o'clock. And then they return and are set to dinner, either with a mess of loblolly, bonavist, or potatoes. Continuing on page 75, almost from the earliest days of the settlement of Barbados, the indentured servants were treated as little more than slaves. For any sign of insubordination or malingering, they were flogged with cowhide whips, leaving deep scars. Most of the indentured servants were terrified of making any complaints to the magistrates, because the men who sat on the bench were also planters who responded by calling such complaints malicious and very often increased an indentured servant's time by 1 or more years. As I've stated in the past, these so-called indentures were written in pencil. They could be changed at the court's will, the master's will, the owner's will, for any infraction, extending the time of the indenture or the white slave by years and decades. And really, when the treatment of white slaves or indentured servants was so harsh that the life expectancy of a white slave was only 1 to 2 years, did it matter, one, how many years you signed up for, not knowing the parameters of the indenture, as we'll get to, or if that was extended, if you were only expected to live most 1 to 2 years. Continuing, their sufferings being grown to great height, and their daily complainings to one another, being spread throughout the island, at the last, some amongst them, whose spirits were not able to endure such slavery, resolved to break through it, or die in the act, and so conspired with some others, so that a day was appointed to fall upon their masters, and cut all their throats, and by that means to make themselves not only free men, but masters of the island. And so closely was this plot carried, as no discovery was made till the day before they were to put it in act. And then one of them, either by the failing of his courage or some new obligation from the love of his master, revealed the long plotted conspiracy, and so by this timely advertisement the masters were saved. Why would white slaves rebel against their masters in this grand conspiracy if it wasn't harsh? Continuing on page 77. Young maidens of noble families were despoiled of their possessions and dragged almost naked and piercing heaven with their shrieks to a ship bound for the West Indies. That was a quote by Cardinal Giovanni Battista Rinuccini, the papal nuncio to the Confederation of Kilkenny, 1645 to 1648. Continuing on page 114 to 115. The slaves were put to work on the day following their arrival. The young women and girls had already been sent to the big house for their master's sexual gratification, or to be employed as maids or servants. The Reverend E.A. D'Alton, 1910, described the segregation. The men and boys were put to work in the sugar plantations. The girls and women, wives and widows of officers and soldiers, gently nurtured perhaps, and in the manner refined, were to be the wives and mistresses of the West Indian planters, to take the place of negresses and maroons. Their beauty was their ruin and attracted their masters' lustful eyes, and in that land of the tropics and the trade winds, they lived as in a prison, their faith banned, their race and nation despised, their virtue outraged, their tears derided, and as they looked out on the waving fields of sugarcane, they sadly thought of their own dear land, with its fields so fertile and so green, now separated from them forever by thousands of miles of rolling sea. These women and girls were raped by those plantation owners in those West Indian Isles, Barbados, Jamaica, etc. The soldiers that these women were possibly married to, if they were widowed from the soldiers, then that was because the soldiers were fighting in the homeland against the oppression. But even if they were still married and both of them taken as slaves, white slaves, and sent across the seas, that doesn't mean they were kept together. So if the husband went to Barbados and the wife went to Jamaica and she was a good-looking woman, married. She was then raped by plantation owners as a married woman. Continuing with page 115 through to 116. As early as 1638, they were buying the indentures of servant women and breeding from them. The records also show that these stud farms specialized in mixed breeding. A good breeder was an invaluable asset on such farms, but was worn out by her early 20s, having had her first child at the age of 12 or 13. The progeny of such unions, particularly the females, were eagerly sought after by the local planters, who found the Irish sexually cold and unresponsive, having to be whipped into submission. The lightly colored mulatto girls bred on the farms were, on the other hand, not only eager, but also trained for every kind of sexual proclivity. Many of them, therefore, fetched high prices in the brothels of Bridgetown, and some even ended up owning their own establishment. The mulatto boys were sold to homosexual planters or were given work as houseboys in the big houses. These breeding farms, okay, they say that the Irish women were cold to their raping masters. Well, can you blame them? Married women, young girls that were taken screaming from their homeland, as we just read earlier, and sent across the seas to be raped by a bunch of rich plantation owner perverts? Can't blame them. These brothels were set up by these mulatto females, and a lot of the incoming slaves that were not taken up by plantation owners were sent to these brothels. Now, in the lineage of Kamala Harris, you'll see some Negro slaves listed, and you'll see some Creole slaves listed. So I just want to take a moment and give the etymology of that word Creole so that there's absolutely no misunderstanding of what it is. A Creole is a person born in a country but of a people not indigenous to it. The exact sense varies with local use. Fowler in 1926 writes, "Creole does not imply mixture of race, but denotes a person either of European or, now rarely, of Negro descent, born and naturalized in certain West Indian and American countries." So a Creole, essentially back then, was a white person, a white slave. So Hamilton Brown, Kamala Harris's great-great-great-grandfather, owned black and white slaves. Now, the breeding farms, and I'm not insinuating he had breeding farms from this book. The breeding farms then produced, via rape, by these plantation owners, the mulatto race. And we'll continue. On page 118 through 120, the whipping post was set in the center of the slave compound and consisted of a single post driven into the ground with a crossbar at the top. The floggings usually took place at sunset when the slaves had returned from the fields, but before they had dispersed to their huts. The man or woman sentenced to be whipped was stripped naked and the hands were tied to the crossbar, lifting the body so that the toes just touched the ground. The overseer then stood back, removed the whip from his belt, measured the distance, and laid on the first blow. The second stroke crisscrossed the first, and so it went on until the victim fainted. A bucket of cold water, to which salt had been added, was thrown over the slave. When he or she regained consciousness, the flogging continued. Vinegar and at times pepper were rubbed into the victim's wounds simply to increase the pain, and then the slave was cut down and carried to his or her hut. The master sometimes attended such floggings. They were intended as a lesson to the other slaves. It must be remembered that in those days, whipping at the cart's tail throughout a town was a regular public spectacle, and flogging was a ritual punishment in the English Army and Navy. Women field workers were flogged in the same way as the men, but sometimes the overseer would use a lighter whip, which did not inflict as much damage. It was not only at the whipping post that the white slaves were flogged. From the very first days in the fields, they would feel the driver's lash on their backs. Often, these newcomers could not keep up with the experienced blacks in the field, and for this, the lash descended. The mulatto drivers enjoyed using the whip on whites. It gave them a sense of power and was also a protest against their white sires. White women, in particular, were singled out for punishment in the fields. Sometimes, to satisfy a perverted craving, the mulatto drivers forced the women to strip naked before commencing the flogging, and then forced them to continue working all day under the blistering sun. While the women were weeding in the fields in that condition, the drivers often satisfied their lust by taking them from the rear. Rape, rape, rape. We want to discuss rape on these plantations. We have rape. We have the lack of white privilege. Continuing. Slaves, white and black, were sold or exchanged frequently. A slave mart was held in Bridgetown every month, and there a planter could get rid of sucklings, young slaves, sell off some others, and buy any number of new ones he required. Sales were by auction and were advertised beforehand. The slaves at such auctions were stripped, forced onto the auction block, and after a thorough inspection, bought at an agreed price between the vendor and the buyer. Young slave girls, we're talking about white slaves, young slave girls, often only 10 or 11 years old, were bought by the madams of brothels of Bridgetown, frequented by planters and seamen. The white slaves working in the fields endured other torments. An overseer, if he so desired, could withhold water from them all day and then force them to crawl on their bellies to the cattle trough and there drink the muddied water. They had no recourse to anybody, no appeal. If the godlike master of the plantation did deign to ride among them, they had to lower their eyes. To look at him directly invoked a flogging. Even the slightest error in the fields, such as pulling up a ratoon instead of a weed, was punished by a whipping. House servants were flogged by a man known as a jumper, usually a lightly colored mulatto. This obviously shows a large disparity on what Americans are being taught, what humanity is being taught of what so-called indentured servitude was, and anything about white slaves, where they program people that the only people who had to endure any kind of slavery were people of a melanated skin color. Continuing on page 120. Another contemporary writer described some of the other punishments, such as gelding, or chopping off half the foot with an axe. He added, "These punishments are suffered by them with great constancy. For running away, they put iron rings of great weight on the ankles, or pottocks around the necks, which are iron rings with long necks riveted to them, or a spur in the mouth. For negligence, they are usually whipped by the overseer with lance-wood switches till they be bloody, and several of the switches broken. The cicaturns are visible on their skin forever after, and a slave, the more he have of those, is the less valued. After they are whipped till they are raw, Some put on their skins pepper and salt to make them smart. At other times, their masters will drop melted wax on their skins and use several very exquisite torments. Continuing on page 125, the old minute books of the islands show that no more than 20% of the indentured servants who were freed became farmers, overseers, and artisans. There is no record of what happened to the remaining 80%. Some may have joined the militia. Some may have joined the militia. A few became innkeepers or shebeen owners, which is sellers of illegal liquor, and the remainder were probably the ones described by Governor Daniel Searle as wandering vagabonds, moving constantly from plantation to plantation and inciting their compatriots to rebellion. Second only to the fear of mutiny was the governor's and council's fear of the reaction of the Irish in the event of a war with France or Spain. For the Irish, whether free men or runaways, indentured servants or slaves, the best chance of freedom was to escape to the French colonies of the Leeward and Windward Islands. Others joined the pirates of St. Lucia, Tobago, and Dominica. 80%. The farce that indentured servitude was to get into a land and then somehow white privilege took over. 80% became whatever. Vagabonds? Pirates? Continuing. On page 152 through 153, quote, "We must use force in taking them up," end quote. They did not sign any indentures willingly. It is probable that the unfortunate girls and boys could not even speak English, so that the indenture document would be meaningless to them in any case. This mattered little when they reached Jamaica. The laws regarding bondmen were as severe, if not more so, than those governing Barbados or America. A runaway, when captured, was soundly flogged and lost an ear. In addition, for any attempt, an extra year was added to his indenture. More time added, written in pencil. A persistent runaway was hanged on the plantation as a warning to others. For striking a master or overseer or rebellion, the punishment was death by burning. Sir Hans Sloane, who visited Jamaica between 1687 and 1689, described this punishment in his book, A Voyage to the Islands, 1707. Quote, "The punishment of crimes of slaves for rebellion is by burning them. They are nailed to the ground with crooked sticks on every limb, and then applying the fire by degrees from the feet, burning them gradually up to the head, whereby their pains are extravagant," end quote. These are white slaves. He also witnessed some of the other types of punishment inflicted on the slaves. Some were whipped with a lance-wood switch till it was broken. Another was then used, and if that broke, it was discarded and still another was taken up. This continued until the skin was broken and blood flowed. Salt and pepper or molten wax was then poured over the back of the victim to add to their torment. Sloane also described the punishments of those who ran away. When they were caught, they were put in chains with heavy iron rings around their necks. Sometimes they had iron gags tied to their mouths. Sloane did not seem to be unduly upset by these scenes. Continuing on pages 164 through 165. The whole scene bore resemblance to a cattle market. The indentures of these Irish men and women were bought by American tobacco planters. As they did not speak English, the Irish had no idea of what they were signing and very often marked with a cross an indenture that bound them to servitude for 10 to 20 years, all legal in the eyes of the law. Another American writer, quoted by Bennett, J.B. McMaster, goes even further, quote, "They became in the eyes of the law a slave in both the civil and criminal codes, were classed with the Negro and the Indian. They were worked hard, were dressed in the cast-off clothes of their owners, and might be flogged as often as the master and mistress thought necessary," end quote. Certainly, this was the opinion of most of the white planters, who ordered their overseers to work them hard and treat them as they treated their black slaves. In fact, they were treated worse than the black slaves. A contemporary writer, William Edis, in a letter written in 1770 said, quote, "Negroes being a property for life, the death of slaves in the prime of youth and strength is a material loss to the proprietor. They are therefore under more comfortable circumstances than the miserable Europeans over whom the rigid planters exercise an inflexible severity. Generally speaking, they, the white servants or white slaves, groan beneath a worse than Egyptian bondage," end quote. There were few penalties for cruelties to indentured servants. One planter was taken to court for hanging his servant by the heels as butchers do beasts for the slaughter. The penalty? He was rebuked by the court. Another planter, charged with beating his servant to death, was acquitted by the court because there had been provocation on the servant's part. Masters were allowed to flog both female and male servants, quote, "until the blood flowed," end quote. In a case of disobedience, they were permitted to severely whip the offenders and then nail them by the ears to the pillory. Runaway servants were treated with extreme harshness. A law in Maryland passed in 1639 stated that a servant convicted of running away was to be publicly executed. A law passed in Virginia in 1642 declared that a servant who ran away for the second time was to be soundly flogged and branded on the cheek or shoulder with the letter R for runaway. In this next section, we're introduced to a Patrick Quigley, who was a runaway slave. On page 166, one wonders if Patrick Quigley was ever caught, and if so, what punishment he endured. Certainly, Mr. Hardman was willing to expend a lot of money to get him back. There was no difference between the advertisements for runaway indentured servants and slaves. Page 167. Like Barbados, the whip, the symbol of the master's authority, was in daily use, wielded by blacks, mulattoes, or poor whites who had completed their indentures. Bennett writes that it was not unusual in those days for white masters to force a white woman to marry a black male servant. Force is rape. These, again, there's your breeding farms. Nor was it unusual for a white master to give a black man a position of authority over white male and female servants. They often exceeded their authority, and it was not unusual for a black driver to flog a white man until he became unconscious for some small fault or imagined slight. And I'm going to stop there because there is a lot of information in these books that has been purged by the third generation through gaslighting, so that people think that the only slaves were of a melanated color, and that is simply not true. So if we're going to talk about slavery and reparations, and we're going to talk about a 1619 project that is full of misinformation, and we're going to talk about Kamala Harris and rape in the West Indies Islands, and rape in these colonies, and slave plantations, and the breeding of people, white slaves, then we need to discuss the full story, or we don't need to discuss anything. But to say that there are sins of America and scars of our past and point to only a melanated people being on the receiving end of them is wrong. And that is the end of this video. Like, subscribe, and share. Have a good day.